Hello and welcome to today's video. I am Will and I'm going to be talking about Stephen Fry's mythological retelling so far. I think the collection is called Stephen Fry's Great Myths. And so it kicks off with Mythos, then Heroes, then Troy, and then Odyssey, which was released just a few weeks ago. And so in total, of course, a quartet of 4 mythological retellings which work fantastically together. Of course, Stephen Fry has intended for them all to be read, and he wrote them in an order that makes sense. With Mythos, it is the origins of Greek mythology, the beginning of the gods, taking frame into what we know kind of now. Most people will have a little background knowledge, but this really, the whole series approaches you from a direction that if you don't know any of it, you'll really enjoy this. And if you know some, you're going to learn a lot more. I'll get to a little critique later, carrying on from that point. But for now, more just about what the series is like as a whole. As I said, these are accessible stories telling of Greek myth. They are not attempting to subvert your expectations. Not like some of the stories you may see here, like Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker, Circe, A Thousand Ships, Ariadne, and many more wonderful Greek retellings of the last decade or so. They subvert your expectations. They're looking at the Greek retellings from a different perspective in a way that the story has not been told before. Whereas Stephen Fry appears, his main message is to educate you on the Greek myths. Mythos is about the formation of the gods, how they took power, and myth, kind of the celestial, ethereal background. And then we've got Heroes, which follows more the demigods, that's upside down, the demigods, the children of the gods, and the heroes of Greek mythology. And then we've got Troy, which I wonder what that's about. That is, of course, the retelling of the Trojan War. And then finally, the most recent release is Odyssey, telling the story of the Odyssey, but not just following Odysseus, but the events surrounding it with Agamemnon and following that timeline. And so the content in each one, whilst maybe sentences or paragraphs overlap and Stephen Fry will remind you of a previous story, they are all meant to be read together. It's not like if I read Ariadne and one of these, the story would be included in both. Stephen Fry's written them in a way to consume all 4. On to the positives first. Stephen Fry, if you know anything about him, you know he is incredibly witty and he is basically a genius. He knows almost everything there is to know about literature. If he doesn't know anything about Greek myth, then it's almost worth not knowing. In this quartet, he will tell you the roots to words that are really important to us now and we didn't know they came from kind of ancient Greek or Greek myth. He will tell us about the formation of the gods, as I've said already. He engages you in the story in a way that brings them all together and also makes sure to make clear the themes that Greek myth seems to be centered around. And I've got a few quotes which really just stood out to me about this series. Was it possible that mortals were beginning to infect the gods with the perverse self-indulgence of inner feelings? It is their refusal to see any divine beings as perfect, whole and complete of themselves, whether Zeus, Moros or Prometheus, that makes the Greeks so satisfying. For the world seems never to offer anything worthwhile without also providing a dreadful opposite. So there are a few quotes that I think really offer an insight into what Stephen Fry is offering in these stories. He shows why he thinks they are so meaningful to us nowadays, and he gives us a reason to listen or read these books. They are stories that, whilst written in such a different time, that they can still resonate with us, and even if we don't agree with many of the morals of the gods, they're fascinating to follow. But that does lead me to a bit of a criticism of these books and a reason perhaps not to read them if you fall into a certain demographic. Whilst they are very educational, as I said, they're not subverting expectations, so they are giving us the stories that are pretty simple in Greek myth, that if you look it up, you'll find them. So with Troy, for me, I have read Silence of the Girls, The Song of Achilles, I've read the Iliad as well, and so those details are pretty firmly cemented in my head. I am by no means an expert, but I know a lot about the Trojan story. And so with this, as Stephen Fry isn't intending to do anything subversive, I found a lot of it was just treading over common ground. There are still bits that intrigued me, but I probably wouldn't have read this if I knew the content that was going to be in it. There was nothing new for me, and so I didn't really enjoy reading Troy. However, I am definitely not an expert, and I'm far more obscure on the details of the Odyssey and Mythos and Heroes, the content followed in there. So I found them far more enjoyable, and that corresponds to the knowledge I had on the subject. And so that leads me on to, basically I've said in a very long-winded way, I recommend these books if you only know a bit of background knowledge, or even maybe if you're comfortable with the Greek myths, but if you haven't read any retellings of them before, and if you don't have an expert knowledge, then I recommend reading them. If you do fall into those categories, however, I'd recommend skipping maybe the installment that you already know a lot about. For most of people, that will be Troy and the Odyssey, but you may be someone who, for some reason, you know a lot about the stories covered in Mythos, the formation of the gods and the power structures and dynamics, or you may know a lot about the Greek demigods. And so I'd recommend not reading the ones that fall into the subject you know a lot about. But if you do want to read these, I would also recommend listening to them. There's not many books that I'd recommend 100% listening to over reading. I love listening to audiobooks, but most of them, I don't really have a preference of one over the other. But Stephen Fry narrates his own stories. He's an actor, so of course he is just incredible with vocal control. He can do all the accents, and also he's written the story. He knows the delivery he's aiming for. And as this is a story that also relies on wit and humour, Stephen Fry knows how to deliver his own jokes. You'd hope so anyway, and for me, I think he does. I was laughing out loud whilst listening to each of these, even Troy, which I said I did not enjoy as much. I highly recommend listening to these. He also has a very kind of comforting voice. It's one that's so easy to listen to. Of course, as I said, he's got that vocal control. He's a very esteemed and acclaimed actor for a reason, and he transfers all of those skills to being the narrator. I mean, I have so much admiration for these audiobook narrators, and this is another example. Stephen Fry does a wonderful job. It is not easy, but he just understands his work perfectly. He understands humour. He understands what at least makes me tick as a reader, and I imagine most people. He didn't write it just for me, sadly. But that is another huge strength of these stories if you decide to listen to them via audiobook. And to finish the video off, I'm just going to do a quick ranking of the 4. I think there will be no more. He may turn his head to other parts of mythology, and I certainly hope he does. But these are the 4 Stephen Fry's great mythological retellings. So my least favourite of the 4, as I've already talked about, is Troy. For me, I just knew too much about the topic already to be 100% engaged in rehashing the same material. If you have a lot of knowledge about Troy, I recommend reading The Silence of the Girls, one of my favourite books of all time, and there is a review on the channel. And then I have got Heroes. This was a 4.5-star read for me. So the next 3 are books that I all really enjoyed. I loved finding out more about the demigods. It's weird, I thought I knew a lot more than I did, because I felt like, you know, I'm pretty familiar with these stories, and I really wasn't. I knew the names of most of the characters, but the events and the intricate ways in the how the stories unfold had just been lost on me. And so Heroes educated me and made me laugh so much. And then it may be recency bias, but in the number 2 spot for me, I've got Odyssey by Stephen Fry. I finished this a few weeks ago, and it is just fantastic. He just crafts characters so well, and also perfect timing with a film called The Return, with Ralph Fiennes coming out, which I need to watch. And then finally, we've got the one that kicked it all off. We have got Mythos. Maybe it's because it was that kind of endearing, charming beginning to the journey. I wasn't 100% sure what to expect, and then I was enveloped in this witty, sharp, genius retelling of the original stories of the gods and of the wars between the deities of Greek mythology. And as, according to one of the quotes I read earlier, Stephen Fry loves that the Greeks did not think of the gods as perfect. They were each flawed, spurred on by lust, avarice, power, and many other vices along those lines. And that is explored in Mythos. Again, I thought I knew more than I did, and Mythos educated me. It really did, and there's a lot I still remember from reading this. And I'm studying English and history at uni, and so often in literature there are many references to Greek mythology, and so I do find myself referencing myself back to Mythos. Of course, I could just look it up, but I love Stephen Fry's take on it as well. And he's got so many little anecdotes he fits into these stories that just adds, a bit of spice on top to make the dish even more enjoyable. And a bit more flavour and make...
Let me add a little bit of spice to that.
Makes it really rich. It's not just your standard, someone has read the facts, they've read the stories, and they've compiled them here. is different from that, of course, is Stephen Fry. He's a wonderful actor and wonderful writer as well. And so there we go. That is my kind of overall review of the series and ranking as well. Please let me know if you've read these or any Greek retellings. I might do a video at some point, probably on the Brothers Grimm actually, doing a ranking of my Greek retellings that I have read, or just talking about my favourites. Silence of the Girls might be up there, and so will Mythos. But thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you've read any of these. Recommend me any Greek retellings I have not read as well, please. That would be wonderful. But for now, happy reading.